And that's really where progressive politics has come from. So there's just a sense of pride in being connected to Minnesota for me because of my political beliefs. As far as why I decided to run for Congress, I feel like there's a lot of changes that we all demand from our government, but it's a difficult thing to jump into. Most of us who have these demands are not rich, but this is clearly a rich man's game. So I figured I just needed to be that change that I wanted to see in the world. And so we jumped into this, very poor people playing a rich man's game. And so far, we're doing pretty well.
All right. Excellent. And then let's talk a little bit about the 6th district. So where in Minnesota is this? And I see that it's rated as R plus 12. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and sort of what you see as your path to victory in a district like this.
CD6 is a big district. It's the one district in Minnesota that it could be argued is highly gerrymandered, though there's arguments that the courts do look at our districts, and they're not too terribly gerrymandered. But regardless, it's a bit of an awkward-shaped district. It has a lot of greater Minnesota in it. St. Cloud is our biggest city, but we also have some of the northern suburbs of the Twin Cities of Minnesota. So throughout all this area, we have a lot of farmland, we have a lot of rural area, and I think that that's what leads to an R plus 12. And I really do believe that the biggest problem the Democrats have, and the reason why we let Republicans just walk all over us in rural areas, is because we have this weird idea that folks aren't progressive in rural areas, and that running on a progressive message isn't going to work. You have to be Republican light. Well, I don't think that anything could be further from the truth. When I go around CD6 and I talk to people, I find out that the issues that they have, regardless of who they voted for in the past, has a lot to do with healthcare. It has a lot to do with concerns about corruption in government. So addressing those concerns is what will be my path to victory. It's the message, not the money.
You haven't yet had your primary in Minnesota, but you're running unopposed in the Democratic primary. But it looks like the incumbent, who is a Republican, is being primaried. Do you know anything about what's going on the Republican side?
Yes, I know that Tom Emmer is running against A.J. Kern. There's another person in the race as well, but he's not likely to do well. A.J. Kern is his biggest concern. She got about 30% of the primary vote in 2016 when she ran. And, well, she's essentially very pro-Trump, very anti-immigration, anti-refugee, and we do have we have a large refugee population, mostly Somali here in CD6. And so running on all this vitriol and hate, unfortunately, might be something that helps her this year. I think it helped her a lot in 2016, and I don't really know what we'll see this time around. If I end up running against A.J. Kern instead of Tom Emmer, so be it. I think that changes the way that I run a little bit, because I have to be much more positive about accepting the people in our community. At very least, Tom Emmer's not as vehemently anti-immigration.
And this district, of course, famously was the home district of Michelle Bachmann, who is not progressive.
No, not terribly.
Do you have any sense for sort of how she was able to win in a district like that? And if that, so she retired, and that's when Tom Emmer became the congressman there. But do you get a sense that people there, some of them would still vote for Michelle Bachmann if she were running?
Certainly some would. There's no question of that. But the impression that I really get from CD6 is a sense of embarrassment about Michelle Bachmann. And that's very true of the DFLers here, of anyone who's more progressive. But it's not necessarily true of all of our conservative neighbors. Some of them thought that she did a good job, but a lot of them are also embarrassed by her. I think they enjoy the fact that they got to trade in for Tom Emmer because he is a little bit more moderate, at very least in what he says, how he speaks. Now, as far as how he votes, they're very similar to each other.
So you mentioned that you're running a grassroots campaign, and The incumbent, like many Republican incumbents, has a very large war chest that he has to spend, and you've raised less money than he has. But tell me about what it means to be running a grassroots campaign and how you're able to compete with less money.
Absolutely. I mean, grassroots is typically just code for poor in the political world, right? But, the reality of it is it means that we get less money, but we have more volunteers. And I honestly believe that the volunteers are worth much more than an equivalent donation. When you actually have people who can spread a message, it's just worth more than the television ads. And that's another thing. We use our money incredibly responsibly, and we look at what works, what historically has worked, and what can we do on a dime. And that's a lot of Facebook ads, it's Google ads, but it's also organizing door knocks and making sure that we are actually out in the community. And I think going about an election in this way, where it's really about communicating with our constituents rather than just plastering my face everywhere, I think that that's a better way to do politics. It can be a lot more difficult. It's certainly much more time consuming, but it's much more rewarding. And I think in the end, you actually reach people and change minds.
I noticed that among your events coming up, you have a phone bank at your house. That's grassroots.
Well, my house is also my campaign headquarters. Luckily, that is changing soon. We're opening up another campaign headquarters that's going to be much more centrally located in CD6. But yes, for the entirety so far, this has been the campaign office, which means I wake up in the morning and I'm at work, and I go to sleep still at work. But that's the way it needs to be. It's an incredible amount of work to run a congressional campaign, and it's been amazing what we've accomplished still being in this house.
So you started to mention some of the issues that you think are important in District 6. Can you expand a little bit on what are the issues that you're really hearing about as you're talking to people, and what are the issues that really motivate you?
Healthcare is by far the biggest one here in CD6. That's one that goes across every bit of political divide. So it doesn't matter how conservative the person I'm speaking with is, they have issues with healthcare as it currently is. And they've seen that the damage done to the ACA has not been helpful to them. And they're ready to entertain a new way of dealing with healthcare in this country. We're all very upset that this is the only developed nation that people are still going into debt and bankruptcy for medical bills, and we want to change to that. Another one is getting the money out of politics. That's the number one issue that I run on, and it's another one that crosses the political divide. Everybody is upset about the corruption, and there's nobody that I've met so far that thinks that money in politics is a positive influence. Now, when I talk more to my base of the DFL, I'm getting a lot of concern about the environment. And I think that is a very reasonable one considering who I'm running against. Tom Emmer has been leading the charge in destroying environmental protections right here in Minnesota, specifically for the boundary waters. He is also one of the top Republicans pushing the elimination of protection of wildlife that's endangered. And so whenever you're up against that, then we definitely have a strong push for environmental protections. And I think that that's an absolutely wonderful thing. We need to do something about climate change, and we also need to do something about making sure that we're keeping our water safe and clean.
And water's a big deal in Minnesota, right? Land of 10,000 lakes?
Very much so. And also we only have about 40% of our water that isn't contaminated, which is, well, it's a little bit embarrassing for a place in which water is so important.
So you mentioned earlier that labor is really important in Minnesota. There seems to be something strange going on in the country. What seems strange to me, that labor unions that have always voted for Democrats in the past seem to, in some cases, be siding with Republicans in ways that make no logical sense at all to me. But can you talk about what you see in your campaign with labor and the importance of labor and how they're reacting to your campaign?
Well, if you're hoping to find the logical sense as to why they're voting Republican, I cannot help you there. I can't find it either. But I do worry that one of the reasons why we have a lot of labor unions kind of veering towards the right is because the Democrats haven't necessarily helped the labor union that much either. Here in Minnesota, we're the DFL, we're the Democratic Farm Labor Party, and we do care about labor. And you are very hard-pressed to actually get an election if you're not going to talk about the issues that labor is experiencing right now. There's a full-blown attack going on against it, and they need people to defend them. I think that's really important. And the reason being the labor movement has always been where the progressive push has come from. The labor movement is the reason why wages don't stay stagnant for certain types of jobs. But whenever we keep destroying our labor unions, then that's when we find our wages become stagnant. That's when we lose protection. It's when we lose good health care. And I think the crux of a lot of the income inequality that exists in this country is because of the attacks on the labor union. It is incredibly important, but a lot of neoliberal policies from Democrats have hurt labor unions. There's a lot of Democrats who don't fight against right-to-work laws. And whenever we see that, then I understand why labor unions are under the impression that Democrats aren't standing up for them anymore. And we've got to change that.
All right. Are there other issues and things that you would like to talk about?
You know, here in CD6, farming is an incredibly important issue. That farm bill is coming up, and it's not looking good. There's some actually really nice provisions in it that I greatly appreciate. Things like opening up hemp production for farmers across the country. I think that that's an excellent idea. I hate that there's a provision that essentially says you cannot grow hemp if you have ever been convicted of a drug-related crime. I think that that's a racist policy, quite frankly. But it's nice that that was opened up. It's also nice that there's certain provisions that allow if there wasn't a specific will written for land, you can still get subsidies for farming in a way that used to that was blocked off if there was any contest for who the new land belongs to. But beyond those things, it's very abysmal. It gets rid of the caps on subsidies. So that means larger factory farms are able to grab subsidies for all acres that they have instead of just a set amount. And whenever we have President Trump talking about giving $12 billion in subsidies to farmers, well, we know where that money will go. It's not going to go to family farms. It's instead going to go to large factory farms. And that is very upsetting to me.
What are the crops that are important in that district? I'm from Ohio and just spent some time back with my parents, and it was just cornfields everywhere. So that's the primary type of farming that I'm familiar with.
Well, the big one we're concerned with right now is soybeans, because we have a lot of soybean farmers here. And of course, with China deciding to no longer continue trade with the United States because of the tariffs, we have a lot of farmers of soybeans who don't know what the next step is. You know, hopefully subsidies will be able to help them. And I do think that, you know, providing them with some aid during this time is the only responsible move after such a truly irresponsible one. Mm-hmm. So I want trade, not subsidies, but unfortunately, I'm not sure if we're going to find a market quite the same size as China. You know, even if we do open up some soybean trade with the EU, with some other countries, is it really going to be what we had beforehand? And we might have to switch crops. That's very difficult for farmers to do. But regardless, I mean, we have to talk about these issues and find solutions to them. And just tossing money onto it is not a long-term solution.
All right. Well, if our listeners would like to help your campaign out, how can they do that?
Well, they can always visit me at iantoddforcongress.com. There they can find my Act Blue. So if they're interested in donating, they can do it from there. If they're interested in volunteering, because they're somewhere around here in Minnesota, then there's applications for them to fill out there. Other than that, find me on Facebook, like the page, share the stories. It's actually really incredible how much somebody sharing things on the wall can help my campaign out.
All right. Excellent. Well, Ian, thank you so much.